Hi, thanks for tuning in to Working Musicians. Today I'm going to be talking about home versus pro studios. Per usual, I wanted to thank Doers for helping make this episode possible. Alright, so home versus pro studios. What's the difference? One of the big things is that the perceived differences versus reality can be very stark and sometimes very similar. When I think of a pro studio, I think of $500,000 mixing boards, thousands upon thousands of dollars invested in just room treatment, awesome lights, awesome ambiance, just truly a professional environment. Where there's millions upon millions spent to make the best possible production possible. Now, reality is, most of us are never going to go tracking there. And if we do, they've probably got Studio B or C, which is about the only thing close to in our price range. And that's where things get kind of sticky, is the price range. If you go look out on Craigslist, you'll see there's, actual studios that are on the internet. There's actual studios out there. Some of the local ones where I'm at, they've got some, I'd say, decent equipment. They've got decent spaces with some decent acoustic treatment. But let's just say they're a far cry from what I would call a professional studio. While they do have an actual place to go and record, and they have people who are knowledgeable, it seems like there's becoming a huge difference between what a pro studio is and a home studio, and it seems like the lines are being blended on the in-between. So, just once again, when I say a pro studio, I'm talking about something where like some of your favorite musicians of all times have gone to record their albums at, right? Not necessarily the studio down the road, right? And so, while there are definitely some good studios out there, actually where I live, within probably about 10 miles of me, there is a very professional studio who have done some amazing albums from some very reputable artists. But that's kind of a random thing. In fact, it still boggles my mind that this studio was purchased and then moved to my hometown. The odds of that happening are very, very unlikely. And as it just so happens, I happen to know the people who own it and run it. In fact, I used to play shows with these guys. While I've never recorded there, I have been there, and I can honestly say this is a first-rate studio. And just to put into perspective, just to kind of get in there, they're charging you, I haven't checked prices recently, but easily $100 an hour just to go in there and track. And I think that's a pretty competitive rate for what they have. I think it's definitely worth it to a lot of people. But, that's kind of the difference. Is there, up until recently, they did have a $500,000 mixing board. They got rid of it because it just, nowadays, it's kind of getting to the point where recall is so big that it just becomes kind of impractical to use the analog mixing boards nowadays. But at one point in time, they did have one. I believe it was an SSL duality board. In fact, I believe that's exactly what it was. In fact, I'm 100% certain because I looked at it and touched it. But, so a home studio is kind of like the polar opposite of what I would call a pro studio. Generally speaking, they have very little. I mean, ideally, they'd have at least $1,000 in just professional studio equipment, but oftentimes it's much less than that. A home studio is usually in a spare bedroom, a basement, or heaven forbid, the attic above the garage, or something to that extent. And so, as you can probably imagine, one of the big differences between a pro and a home studio is just the pro studio was built to be a studio. The home studio was not. So a lot of what's done in home studios is basically kind of crowbarred so as just to make things work. But what does that mean to you as a musician? And more importantly, as a working musician? Because at some point there is a benefit to going to a pro studio And at some point there's a benefit to doing stuff yourself at home. And then there's kind of the stuff in the middle. So what I really want to talk today about is the pro studio, the middle of the road studio, and then the home studio. And you kind of find that down the middle of the road, the lines become kind of blurred. So when I talk about the pro studio, well, let's think about some of the pros and cons to the pro studio. Obviously, the big pro is that they have awesome equipment. They have a huge investment, and not just mics, preamps, converters, but the room itself. It's amazing how big of a difference a good sounding room can make on the equipment you have. You know, $3,000 microphone into a $3,000 preamp into a $3,000 converter in a basement just does not sound very good. In fact, sometimes just the better the equipment you use in the worst sounding environment can sometimes be more detrimental than a cheap dynamic in a bad sounding room, because the high end equipment is very sensitive to how things sound, and so if it's not in a good sounding room, it's really going to embellish that, because it's going to pick up every nuance that sounds bad, the flutter echo, the slapback, just the unpleasant sounding bass, rumble, and mud that can happen in a bad room. So clearly, when you start thinking about a pro studio, I mean, just the room treatment alone is more costly than the amount of equipment most home studios will ever have in their entire setup. So just from square one, having an acoustically tuned room is just huge, and making things sound professional and as crisp and clean as possible. And that's really one of the big things that separates the pro studios from the non, is you just walk into one and it just sounds great. It's just like, wow, you get excited about recording in there just based on you walk in there. The sound of it is great. And then you start looking at all the lights of the expensive rack gear, and you know the awesome $3,000 microphones, and it gets you excited. So one of the big things is when you're at a pro studio, it's just kind of motivating in and within itself, because you are in basically a temple of awesome sound. And on top of that, in a perfect world, it'll also be accompanied by people who really, really know what they're doing. So when you look at the cost of what you get in nowadays in a pro studio, it's just kind of ridiculous to think how cheap it really is to go record in some of these places, until you start looking at some of the cons. Of course, the overhead is a big thing that comes to mind when how much it costs per hour. But the other thing to take into consideration is the time and the quality of the engineer. It's been said before that an awesome engineer with second-rate equipment will do a better job than an amateur engineer with top-rate equipment. And that is absolutely the case. Sure, equipment does make a big difference, but knowledge and skill set and experience are not replaceable to gear. So you got to look at it. If you're at a place where they're charging you $100 an hour to record in a very nice studio with thousands upon thousands, let's say $1 million studio, and they're charging you $100 an hour, there's a good chance you're not getting their chief engineer. You're probably getting if you're lucky, a staff engineer, if not somebody who's more like an intern. Because at the end of the day, like, that's something you have to pay for. So when it really comes down to the cost of it, you're not just looking at the cost of the equipment, the overhead that you're basically renting by the hour, or in reality, at those kind of places, it's more like by the day. You also got to take into consideration, if you're being charged $100 an hour at a studio that has $1 million of overhead just in the building, they're probably not using their best engineer, because that best engineer is going to have his own fees on top of that. So when it comes to getting a very good engineer tracking you, the cost goes up exponentially, because those guys have a skill set. It is in demand, and they are few and far between the people who are really, really good at what they do. And obviously, at $100 an hour, you are not getting Grammy award-winning engineers. You're getting just the staff engineer who makes a fairly low wage. So that's something you got to take into consideration. So you got to look at the budget. Budget is a huge thing for everyone, all the way from the pro studios to the home studios. So I'm going to say, let's say take $10,000, which might be an astronomical amount of money to a home studio guy, but to a pro studio, it's really not that big of a deal. If you go to a pro studio and approach them with a $10,000 budget, they will likely work with you. No doubt about it. I mean, that's not a chump change, but if you look at the cost of a pro mastering engineer who has Grammys under his belt and top 40 hits, you begin to realize $10,000 will cover just the mastering costs, not the mixing costs, not the tracking costs, just the mastering cost alone. So you got to take that into consideration. If your all-in budget is $10,000 for recording, mixing, and mastering, even then, you're taking a cut somewhere. And it's going to be in the quality of the engineers you're using. Top name engineers are not going to record, mix, and master for $10,000. $10,000 might be enough to just master an album, but it's not going to be enough to do all of the above. So when you got to consider what your budget is versus where you're going, even at $10,000, that to them is a budget album. So if $10,000 is your budget for recording, mixing, and mastering, you've got to realize that you're not a top priority at some of these pro studios. Not to say they won't take your money and do their darndest with it, and give you the best possible product they can. You got to imagine that if the engineer you contract out just to record you is doing it for $100 an hour, and on top of that the studio charges $100 an hour, you're in at $200 an hour, and that's not getting you top level engineers. That's giving you a very good studio that they're renting out, but it's not giving you a top level engineer. And then on top of that, the best of the best mix engineers, you can't afford. Bottom line is you can't afford. Their time is booked up. You are not worth their while. So that's kind of one of the disheartening things when you find out when you go to a pro studio is, okay, they have their head engineer and you never meet him, you never see him. Why? Because you're not worth their time with your budget. So I think most of us kind of rule out going to pro studios just because at some point it is not cost effective to go to the world's, or to the nicest studio you can afford to just get your foot in the door at, and then to have an intern tracking you, or even worse, an intern mixing you. So it's one of those things, when you go to those places, you need to know who's doing what and what your budget really does get you and what it affords you. Because when I say that $10,000 to master an album is not out of the range of reality for a professional mastering engineer, that's the honest truth. So keep your budget in mind, because obviously $10,000 is not a small sum of money, but compared to what it costs to make a truly, truly professional album with truly professional artists and truly professional engineers, it's really kind of a drop in the bucket. Now, obviously, budgets on albums nowadays are nowhere near like they were. $100,000 is still a pretty sizable budget for top 40 artists, but back in the day, that was chump change. $100,000 probably wouldn't even cover just the editing costs back when we were using tape. Now, naturally, the digital age has kind of changed that a lot. It got to where there's just fewer and fewer people touching a project just because it's just not necessary. But just something to take into consideration, that while $10,000 might not be enough to really raise the eyebrows at the world's most truly professional studios, it is enough to get you in the door of truly professional studios, but not with the world's most renowned engineers. Now let's talk about home studios. Obviously, if your budget is $10,000, and you're not going to be looking at home studios. You're going to be looking at somewhere in between, right? So that's kind of one of the big drawbacks to the home studio, is because generally speaking, the home studio does not have anywhere near the amount of overhead to justify, any band, artist, group, label that has a somewhat, significant budget. They're going to go somewhere more on the pro side or somewhere in between there to do their work. So guys that are operating out of the home studio are A, working on much smaller budgets, and B, working with artists who are realistic to the fact that it does not make sense for them to spend $10,000 on recording, mixing, and mastering their album, because they're not going to get that return on their investment. So the home studio guys are working with, so to speak, some of the bottom of the barrel. Not always, because obviously there are people out there who are awesome musicians, and there are definitely plenty of them. But people who, it's more of a hobby. It's not their profession. So the thought of spending $10,000 to make an album just doesn't make sense, because they're not going to be out on the road promoting it. They're not going to be touring. They're not going to be doing most of that stuff that you would consider a band in the market for making it, so to speak. They're just not interested in doing that, right? So that's where kind of the home studio has some pros and cons to it. One of the big pros is a lot of people do the home studio thing because otherwise they would never spend the amount of money or spend the amount of time it would take to justify going to a professional studio. Clearly somebody who's serious about what they do, $100, an hour. So, I mean, what's $800 a day for a full 8-hour block of recording? That a lot can be done in a full 8-hour block if you're a good artist and you're well rehearsed. But at some point, there's a lot of things that just don't make sense in pro studios. Pre-production would be one of them. I think if somebody is serious about making a good album, I just don't see why they wouldn't go ahead and spend, a few $100s to get a little interface, a cable, mic stand, and a microphone, so they can do the pre-production themselves. Sure, there's a little bit of a learning curve into how to use the stuff, but come on. Most of us know how to use computers at this point. So, and you can easily figure out the basics of what it takes to record something, just to the point where you can get ideas on paper. So the home studio is, I think, indispensable when it comes to pre-production. Even me personally, if I had the mindset and the wherewithal, where like, hey, you know what? I'm going to go out there and I'm going to push this album, and I'm going to do my darndest to make sure that it's as professional as it can be and it's pushed as hard as I possibly can. Sure, at that point, I'm going to be eventually taking it to a pro studio, and I'm not talking like just the little local $50 an hour studio, in the general area. No, I'm talking about, I'm going to go out to California, and I'm going to go to some of my favorite, mixing engineers, and I'm going to go to a real studio, and I'm going to do it right, and I'm going to spend the money. But in the meantime, I am not going to spend the money on pre-production. I'm going to do that myself. So when it comes to the home studio environment, I think there is a huge market for people doing pre-production work there. Whether it's just for themselves or whether it's for other people. I mean, I think $35 an hour is a pretty reasonable rate for a home studio guy to do pre-production for somebody, because just the value that somebody receives just by having somebody click the buttons and that knows how to use the gear is it's chump change when you think about what it buys you. Because when you're trying to record stuff, it is really hard to do both things at the same time. I mean, run from the booth or run from the live room, or, most people, it's just a room. They don't even have the luxury like I do of having a closet or a booth, so to speak. I mean, they're just right in front of their computer. They turn their chair around, hit start, turn it around, play in front of the microphone, then turn around, hit stop when they're done tracking. So, I mean, while that is definitely it's something that I think a person can do at home, I mean, if your goal is to get through it and you don't want to learn how to use all this stuff and you don't want to spend the money that it takes just to have the equipment and to maintain it, there's nothing wrong with that, because there's so many home studios that would be happy to work with you and that would have just super cheap rates just to help you with this project, and they would enjoy doing it. So me personally, if I've got somebody who's all in budget for a professional album is $10,000, that's great, because I don't need anywhere near that, and I can do every bit of it myself in the home studio environment. And now, obviously, are they going to get as good of results? Well, maybe, maybe not, because I'm willing to bet I'm at least as good of an engineer as what's in some of these semi-pro studios, or oftentimes what's in some of these pro studios. Something that not everyone realizes: some of these, interns pay to have the privilege of being able to say that they worked at this super professional studio. So there's a good chance that you've got a guy who really doesn't know what they're doing, even at a super professional studio. And once again, I think everybody would much prefer to have the best engineer with second-rate equipment than an amateur engineer on top-rate equipment. And so there's definitely something to be said about that in the home studio environment. And, and once again, just having somebody who is competent with their gear and can help you with the pre-production phase just by clicking buttons, so that you don't have to worry about that as you're trying to, write your song and just get ideas on paper, that can be huge. But at the same time, I think it's fairly easy for most of us to be able to do pre-production on their own, just with, under $500 investment. You can really save yourself a lot of money in the long run. We're talking about the average person who has a little bit of money that they can spend on their album, but not enough to where it makes sense to go out to the super pro studio and spend $10,000 just on tracking to get a good engineer for a day or for about maybe a week to track their album with them in a good studio. So let's put that kind of behind us, because I think that doesn't really relate to most of us in the working musician community. So let's say you're that guy who has, a 2-channel interface, a couple of microphones and a laptop and maybe some decent monitoring. By decent, I mean, you've got a decent set of headphones and possibly $200 to $300 of actual monitors. That's good enough to help you with pre-production. I'm not saying that you can't use, a $500 setup and make a kind of pro sounding album, but realistically speaking, you're selling yourself short if your goal is to actually sell the music that you're producing. And if you're not, that's fine. But for pre-production, cheap is fine. Absolutely. Especially if you know how to use your stuff, it's fine. It's a fun hobby. But if you're serious about making your album come to life and making it sound as professional as possible, it's not necessary to drop tens of thousands of dollars. But you have to be realistic with what your budget is and what people are willing to do for you. So that's where kind of the middle of the road studio comes in. Well, I'm a huge proponent of doing your pre-production yourself. And if you're fairly skilled and have been doing it for a while and have at least, perhaps a few $1,000s invested in your studio, and by a few thousand, that could be $2,000, But if you have, maybe some room treatment, some decent mics, some decent preamps and conversion, decent monitoring, it is possible that you can, within your home studio, get some pretty good results. I think I get pretty good results from my studio, but, I've certainly paid for it. And if my goal was simply just to go out and make music, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have, several $1,000s of studio equipment like I have. For me, it's a hobby and I enjoy it. I deeply, deeply enjoy doing this. And every year I get better and better at mixing, recording, and mastering. But if I'm a singer-songwriter or a band, it really takes away from the spirit of what you do when you have to learn how to record, mix, and master. In fact, it's almost to the point where the amount of time and money and effort you spend doing it is just not worth it if that's not your goal and your passion. If it is your passion, oh, it's one heck of a rabbit hole to jump down, a very expensive one, and very worthwhile and very rewarding. But I think for a lot of people, we don't care how the sausage is made. We just want you to eat it, you know? So if you look at it from the perspective of somebody who's a musician or a songwriter or in a band, and they want to make an album and they want to have something to be able to sell or hand out at their shows, buying studio equipment doesn't really make sense. So, like I've mentioned before, a good idea is do your pre-production. I think I've mentioned it before. Pre-production is always going to be a huge focus on this show because it is by far the most important step you take in the recording process, and just the process of making an album. But at some point, it doesn't make sense to learn how to do this and buy the equipment and make that an investment of time and energy and of course money. Let's say the $5,000, for example, that somebody could spend on making a decent home studio setup could easily be spent on making an album that would far surpass anything that they would do on their own. Just because there is something to be said about people who know what they're doing. And that's where I think some of these middle of the road studios come into play. Now, here's the weird thing. Some of these middle of the road studios are indeed home studios. But when I think of a middle of the road studio, I'm thinking more of a place that does have, that $1,000 of room treatment, that does have, a few $1,000s of mic preamps and has a few $1,000s of microphones and has very good converters, something along the lines of Lynx or Apogee, if you go into a studio and they're trying to rock their, sub $500 interface as the main rig of their system, and they're using the stock preamps and converters, realize that that's fine. I'm not saying you can't get good results out of that, but that's not really what I'm talking about when of a middle of the road studio. I'm talking about a place that has, $4,000 or $5,000 invested in just their interface system alone. So you figure a studio that's got, let's just say, on the average of $20,000 on up invested in their studio. That's what I'm talking about, is a middle of the road. And of course, prices vary on the better it is and the more stuff they have in the gear list. Obviously, a studio that's got $80,000 invested is likely going to come with a price tag more so than a studio that's got $20,000 invested, and rightly so. But realistically, that's where a lot of these guys who are in bands, singer-songwriters, are looking to go to make their albums. So something to take into consideration when you go to these places is sometimes you are getting a great value by spending that $50 an hour, or buying that 8-hour block at a slight discount. It's crazy. Some of the engineers that I follow at their studio, when they're kind of at a low, they'll offer like ridiculous rates at their projects, at their home studios, so to speak, or their personal studios, even though the bulk of their work is done out on the road in other states, countries, what have you, and, state-of-the-art facilities. But they have their own studios at home. At home, or generally by home, what I really mean is kind of like they have their own personal studio, whether it's in their home or in a separate environment. But it's amazing how you can get a very, very good mix engineers to do some of your stuff. And now, just because, hey, they're not working at the moment, they're at a low point, and sometimes it happens. It's like sometimes it's better to take the bird at hand than try to go for the two in the bush. And so I've seen guys, offering just great values at their own studios, and more importantly, they're very, very good at what they do. So that personally would be how the road I would take if my goal was to spend, a decent amount of money, but to try to get the best possible album I could. But that usually involves traveling, generally to the West Coast, which as a Texas native and where I live, that's not really practical, but, pie in the sky idea, that's what I would do. But most of us are looking at more of our local studios that have that, tens of thousands of dollars invested, and that have the equipment and the room treatment, and more importantly, the space to go to actually record an album, mix, master, what have you. So That's where I think the middle of the road studio is just so huge in the current music scene that we live in. Obviously, top 40 chart hits are not being produced at those studios, but the other 95% of us, that's where we're going. And this is where the lines get kind of blurred. I've seen these studios where they've got a separate, building. It's a commercial building where they have studios set up, and I'm looking at the equipment list, and Behringer is on it more times than they probably want to admit. At that point, it's just basically a home studio in a commercial location. And then there's sometimes I'll see on Craigslist people advertising their home studios, and they've got $40,000 worth of equipment. And what they have is absolutely better than some of the places you would go that are more commercial locations. And so I think it's important to really go out and talk to these people, email them, call them, contact them. Don't be afraid to network with these guys and be like, hey, this is what I want to do. Is this worth your time? Me personally, you'd be amazed at some of the work I'll do for people just because I like what they do. Most of the work I do, I'm not really out there trying to make money off people. Most of the people I work with are friends or acquaintances to some extent, and my goal is not necessarily to make money off them. So a lot of these guys are really just trying to, this is their passion. They do it for themselves, but hey, if they can do a little bit to make money on the side to help pay for their habits, so to speak, they're very happy to do it. And you'd be surprised at what, some of these quote unquote home studio guys will do for $500. And they're happy to do it. Versus if you go to one of those middle of the road studios, they've got overhead, they've got bills to pay. $500, that's great, but that's, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, $500, that's a full day of tracking. That's what you get. Whereas $500, that's a full day of tracking. I'll mix it and then give you a quick master. So that can be something to take into consideration. But I think if, generally speaking, you'll find that the middle of the road studios where they have an actual location is a very good place to go, assuming they have a good room and good acoustic treatment, because there are some things that just don't make sense to do in a home studio. Big one would be drums. I personally have a home studio set up, and I'm not saying it doesn't leave anything to be desired. I've got some nice gear in here, and I can do drums, but I'll be perfectly honest, you're probably better suited doing drums at one of those middle of the road studios than you would be here. Simply put, yeah, I can record 10 channels in at once, but I don't really have the room, the space, the setup to do it properly. Generally, when I record drums, I'm doing the recorder man technique, which is like 4 microphones. And fortunately, I know a drummer who I'm related to who is phenomenal, and I'm going to do my damnedest to get him on the show. But he is a phenomenal drummer. So doing the recorder man, it's like, unless I'm doing a modern, like hard rock album or something like that, it just works. And I'll probably get into more about the technique of that kind of drum miking in the future. But recorder man technique is basically a good technique to use because for home studio guys, because it kind of takes the nastiness of the room a little bit more so out of the equation versus like a spaced pair using 15 microphones on a drum set. But at the same time, you don't have as much flexibility. So if you don't have a good drummer who knows how to tune and an EQ himself as he's playing, it can be very difficult to get a good product. But as usual, garbage in, garbage out. So if you've got a really good drummer, like I happen to be related to, the recorder man technique seems to work just fine. And I'm only using 4 out of the 10 inputs. Now, sometimes I'll add an extra mic or two to the situation, but realistically, I would be better served if I were to go to a real studio that's got an actual room and really has the right mics and acoustics to be able to do this. But of course, that's to each their own, and that's the call that they have to make. But something like drums is a very good thing to go to a semi-pro studio to record, just because it's it's less headache in the long run, much less time editing, and generally you get a better product out of a room that's got maybe $1,000 of acoustic treatment and $5,000 of microphones versus in your home studio where you've got no acoustic treatment and under $1,000 of microphone, if even $500. So just something to take into consideration. There is definitely a benefit to a lot of the semi-pro studios versus the home. But when you think about it, when you go to a semi-pro studio, there's a good chance you don't know the people in there. And especially if you're doing vocals, I've come to notice that people generally do vocals better in their own home, in their own comfortable environment than they do in even a super pro studio. I don't care how good of the equipment is if you have a bad performance, I mean, you're just basically microphoning a fart upside down. It doesn't matter. So there is definitely something to be said about, hey, where the home studio guys have an advantage. It's much more intimate, much more comfortable, much more what the typical home musician or the working musician is used to working in. So there are times where it makes more sense to do something like perhaps vocals at a home studio versus a semi-pro. Yet doing something like drums at a semi-pro studio, and a lot of times makes more sense than doing it at the home. So that's something to kind of take into consideration is, what are you trying to accomplish and where was the best place for you to go and as far as your money spent. And that's where I think the lines really, really blur is there's a lot of guys out there who are excellent mixing engineers, but don't have like a very good studio place. Whereas there are guys who are more so recording engineers and tracking engineers and not as good of mixing engineers, yet they have an actual place. And so they might get more business doing that kind of stuff, even though really their heart's in recording, not so much mixing. So it's one of those things where it definitely pays to network and to know what you're getting yourself into. So if you've got a guy that's a great mixing engineer, use him. But if he doesn't have the right space to be able to do everything you need him to do, go somewhere else and go to somewhere where they do have the right space and the equipment to do what you need to do. And then, hey, there's nothing wrong with, hey, here's $1,000. I'm going to record all my drums here over the course of 3 days. That's fine, or 2 days, whatever the budget is. Record your drums there. If you feel more comfortable going to this person's home studio to do acoustic guitars and vocals, great. I think bass at this point is just so easy to do. I think most people do DI at this point, but even if you are miking an amp, it can be reamped later. But realistically, I think the big ones, if there is drums, I think most home studio guys are not set up to do drums at the level that is needed to make a pro sounding album. And if there's one or possibly two other areas where I'd say there is something to be said about going to a pro studio, it would be for vocals and acoustic guitar. Vocals for the obvious. It's one of those things where you cannot possibly have a golden channel too good for recording your vocals. If everything sounds great but the vocals sound bad, you might as well be singing Yankee Doodle, because it doesn't matter. So if it's one of those things where the vocals are really important, which is probably 90% of music out there, there is something to be said about going to that semi-pro studio or even that super pro studio, spending a lot of money to get your vocals tracked as good as possible. But realize that if you're in a rush, sometimes if your budget is, $1,000 to record vocals over the course of a few days, probably that pro studio is not the right place to go. And if you don't feel comfortable tracking vocals in one of those middle of the road studios, if the vibe's not there, or you just are uncomfortable singing in front of those people, so to speak, maybe that's not the right choice, even though they have better gear. If you get the best performance from a home studio, from a friend, or just in your personal home studio, sometimes that's the best way to go, even though you don't have as good of gear as the semi-pro or super pro studios have. But obviously, to each their own, and each individual is going to know that better than anybody else. But then when it comes to acoustic guitars, that's another one where I would say, hey, you can get away with electric guitars in the home studio with minimal room treatment, but there is definitely something to be said about recording acoustic guitars in a good room with the right microphones. Acoustic guitars, just kind of like acoustic drums, really the room plays a huge importance into the overall sound. And not to say that there aren't things you can't do to mitigate bad rooms with acoustic guitars. You're generally speaking, you want to have as good of a room when you're playing acoustics. Now, obviously, if you just are so nervous you can't play in front of people you don't know, maybe that semi-pro studio is not the right way to go. But I think there's definitely something to be said about if you were to go out as a musician and your budget is $10,000 to make as professional album as possible, you're probably better served by doing your pre-production at a home studio, maybe doing your tracking at a semi-pro studio, and then, if something like vocals is really important, do that at the place wherever you can get the best equipment possible, keeping in mind that you need to get the best performance possible. So just some things to think about. Appreciate everybody for listening. Thanks, guys.